Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. Hope you enjoy. Lightbringer, written by Tal McCall. Smathy, being a practical drone, made her peace with death as a grub. The fact that these pirates were potentially going to sell her as a slave, or perhaps keep her as a laborer, was in many ways comforting. Insurance would compensate the corporation for both the loss of the ship and what remained of her useful life expectancy. Any additional purpose she could serve in her captive life would only magnify the productivity of her life. Sadly, the cargo would likely not be covered, as electromagnetic blast had knocked out communications. Neither the phosphate cargo nor the human laborer would be acknowledged as being received, as no transmission had been sent before reaching the edge of the hyperdense atmosphere. Perhaps Smathy could negotiate with the pirates to send a message confirming the weight of the cargo and the economic value of the human in exchange for the rest of her life spent in faithful service. This idea pleased Smathy, as she began to manually record the cargo weight and purity from memory onto her own skilled carapace. Her species word carried enough trust that the insurance would have no reason to argue a fraudulent statement. There was no reason to hope for a ransom. The logistics of Interstellar did not favor the transport of a single drone for any distance. Having absent-mindedly completed a reasonable valuation of the cargo based on current market prices and remaining logistical costs, she turned her attention to the human. The poor being was nearly tearing itself and the light deck to pieces, while the ship floated silently in the gaseous soup. The extremophile had been hired as a repair technician for the surface mining stations on the planet solely for its ability to withstand the enormously dense atmosphere of this planet. Smathy had only basic knowledge of her passenger and could only roughly approximate the creature's market value based on what her own corporation had paid for his labor. Smathy decided to interrupt the creature's frantic destruction of the ship, as she couldn't be sure the pirates would allow them to speak after capture. "Human laborer, how long do you have left to live?" Smathy motioned to the human after capturing its focus long enough to signal her query. "Smathy, what the feck kind of question is that? I have no idea. Maybe 20 minutes, assuming a standard range on that torpedo, and however long it takes these arseholes to breach the hull. Then they are going to have to pull a wrench from my cold, dead hands. Just hold me with the throttle cable, okay?" The human's method of communication was vibrating Smathy's delicate antennae, but thankfully, her cybernetic translator had survived the electromagnetic pulse due to its largely biotic components and ruggedly simple transistors. "Forgive, human laborer. I mean to determine your remaining economic value, so your owners might be compensated for your loss. You are insured as a subcontractor on board my vessel. However, your irregular boarding was not recorded. I will endeavor to bargain for the right to inform my corporation on your behalf." Smathy was not entirely sure that the human could interpret such delicate signaling gestures accurately, but she felt morally obliged to try. The human inhaled deeply while staring at Smathy. She was briefly unsettled by how casually it absorbed the delicate mixture of gases designed to replicate her own biological needs. When he had requested to come aboard, he had dismissed her atmospheric data despite her protests. Extremophiles or not, the species' indifference to safety was appalling. "Bringer of Light, my name is Bringer of Light, and your concern is a very kind. However, I have no intention of being captured. If you must know, I am 34 years old, and I had intended to retire at 52, but my wife thinks I should stop at 45. Although, with what you guys are paying me, I might be able to just make a couple more contracts and live on the interest." Smathy had to admit the creature's ability to communicate without looking at her was an advantageous trick. Mentally converting his time reference, she realized this creature's economic value was absurdly high. Assuming that he was implying that he was capable of working a contract like this one he had just completed an additional 108 times without his mate prematurely terminating him. Curious as to why his owner would terminate such an economically valuable asset, Smathy resisted the urge to question him further on the subject. Instead, she converted his contract for maximum economic return, as was customary in insurance claims, and came to the staggering conclusion this laborer was worth more than herself and her vessel combined. Excitedly, she concluded that the pirates might even be persuaded to ransom them both, given their lack of need for extremophile hyperdensity repair technician. Unable to contain her excitement, she extracted herself from her work pod and regained the human's attention. "Bringer of light, I believe my corporation would be willing to pay our ransom and retrieval in exchange for ownership of your remaining labor. Unlike your mate, they will not terminate you prematurely." Smathy did not need her translator to discern the utter confusion on the human's main sensory plate. Understandable, the cost of retrieval was enormous. While she attempted to simplify her logic, the human began to pulse incoherent vibrations, startling her and stunning her senses at this close range. "Bringer of light, is that what my name translates to? That's too perfect!" More nonsensical vibrations. "And no one owns me or my labor but me. Still, thank you very much for the offer, but why don't you focus on getting those last 4 throttle cables into the hub here? Then I'll explain why my wife wants to retire me early." The speech returned to the nonsensical vibrations. Having been distracted by her attempts to make an inventory of the ship's value, Smathy had failed to notice there was a purpose to the human's destruction of the ship. Not being an engineer, she could only understand that the human had begun assembly of a crude manual input for the ship's 6 maneuvering thrusters. Ingenious, but pointless. Without a computerized gyro, attempting to manually fire thrusters on full power by physically connecting the cables to emergency power would just cause the ship to wildly flail between the lifting balloon and the hanging cargo pod. It was at that moment she noticed the human had located and removed the emergency manual balloon deflation and the master cargo harpoon disconnect. Frantically, she tapped her appendages on the human's thigh, being unable to reach any higher on the biped. No, the pirates deliberately disabled the ship to spare our lives and the ship itself. If you drop the cargo, it will deem you an unsuitable slave." Without stopping, Bringer of Light continued his work. "Good. I am not a suitable slave, and they are going to learn that real quick." The still functional magnetic proximity sensor began to pulse. The human studied it briefly, speaking again. "Get back in your work pod and strap in. I want you to point at their ship with your right limb and signal their distance with your left. Can you do that?" The human was muttering numbers to himself and staring intently at the harpoon housing wells around the ship. The ship was little more than a 1-deck flat rectangle with lifting cables on each corner and a rectangle lifting balloon on top. The 6 hull-mounted thrusters would normally be able to rotate independently with the aid of the now-bricked computer and gyro. Smathy wasn't even certain the ship was level given the lack of viewports and her own inability to biologically sense pitch. Still, the life of servitude, with the newfound knowledge of how valuable this human was, made denying his orders all but impossible. She had already strapped in by the time she had contemplated his actions. He had built himself a crude thruster controller, and laid out each of the 6 cables roughly in relation to their corresponding thrusters. Additionally, he had similar crude controls of balloon deflation system and the cargo harpoons. It was a mystery to her how the human had managed to orient himself to face the front of her vessel, as nothing inside the ship was oriented in relation to the exterior hull. "Distance 357 mid-units holding. They are preparing to board." Smathy diligently held up her appendage towards the pirate vessel. What the human did next was disturbing. A transparent container was attached by destroyed wiring to the ceiling and deck. The human had turned its back and half-filled the container with some sort of excreted amber fluid. It was now suspended directly in front of the human sensory plate. He had also lashed himself to the deck beside his makeshift controls. "Distance 106 mid-cycles, closing 4 units per cycle. Estimated docking port side. They are going to use the airlock." Relieved, she appreciated that they were not intending to cut the hull. They would have been needlessly expensive to repair. "Ringer, they appear to be reasonable economic pirates. Given your value and the unlikelihood they are aware of your true value, perhaps we could be ransomed for less than your remaining life. There is no need for us to cause property damage unnecessarily." Confident any creature could see the logical solution presented, Smathy allowed herself to relax her clenching plates. "Smathy, I just pissed in a bottle to make an attitude sensor. The amount of necessary property damage is, well, it's a lot." Another deep inhalation of gases, and the human got to work. stealing glances at the signals Spathy was providing. The ship violently rolled 90 degrees when the human suddenly fired the starboard harpoon's disconnect switch. The next cycle of the mag sensor showed the pirates were now halted within the minimum measurable range, no doubt confused at the bizarre situation unfolding beside them. Spathy's ship was now being stretched sideways between the weight of the cargo and the lift of the balloon. The hull had thankfully been made for even greater gravity wells and only offered minor protest at being violently jerked and pulled apart sideways. Adjusting her pointing to what was now the bottom of the deck, she realized the bottle was allowing the human to more accurately gauge the ship's orientation. Genius. But what came next was pure stupidity. The human connected the retraction cable to the exposed battery terminals, and without the computer to regulate speed, they simply shot back to their housing with a vicious ping that shocked the vessel harder than the torpedo had earlier. The housing wells visible from inside the ship were noticeably dented from the fall. "Spathy, direction!" screamed the human. She frantically snapped her limb back to the bearing location. The human paused and quickly took stock of their harpoon wells and where she was pointing. With one hand he feathered the 3 port side thrusters, and with his other he ripped out the fused harpoon cable, neatly flipped the cable in his nimble micro-appendages, and refired the mangled starboard harpoons that screamed back at their damaged wells. Judging by the short spool time of the harpoons, they had both hit the pirate's hull. Designed to haul up enormous quantities of cargo, the harpoons may have well pierced multiple decks after most assuredly breaching the hull. Industrial mounts would have had mechanically sensed deployment and twisted open. They were now slack, but most certainly attached deep inside the pirate's vessel. Thoroughly impressed but utterly baffled as to the purpose of this maneuver, Spathy was forced to concede that much like the pirates, she had no idea what to do now. If they destroyed her ship, the heavy lifting frame and industrial cables would likely survive, and the weight of the cargo would either rip out an entire deck or drag the ship to the crushing depth in the lower atmosphere. There were now 4 objects absurdly joined above the hostile world's clouds, with no clear answer as to how this was going to end. Spathy was a pragmatic drone. Although she didn't know the identity of the pirates, she could guess they were Ionians. More violent than most species, but as logical as any sentient. They didn't want to die needlessly, and neither did she. The most logical answer was to drop the cargo and let the balloon lift them both into the radio contact with the corporate mining network. The pirates would be arrested and everyone would live. There was a small chance that they would simply destroy her ship, and without the weight of the cargo pod, they could attempt to repair the damage caused by the harpoons and escape. However, if she offered to let them leave after safely making repairs, they would have no reason to risk firing on her, and no profit in destroying her after they were released. The complexity of the situation was great, but she trusted the human had considered these factors before the suicidal maneuver. In awe, she returned her gaze to the human in time to see him manually retract and deflate the balloon. All of her admiration turned to fear in an instant. This lunatic was going to kill them all. The improvised gyroscope was a frothy mess of useless bubbles. The pirate ship was now an unwilling replacement for the primary lifting balloon as Spathy's ship swung like a pendulum with the cargo container. This is all a guess, as there were no viewports to look upon the madness the human had caused. The previously slack port cables were now taut as they dragged the pirate ship down. No doubt the pirate's still active gyros and engines were frantically trying to lift and balance the massive weight of the industrial lifter and her cargo. A limitation of sign language without pheromonal signaling meant that, to the human, her desperate question must have translated as calm and measured. "Now what?" she helplessly signaled to the deranged ape, looking as stunned as she felt. "I guess we bring the light," he muttered to himself more than to her. Simultaneously redeploying the lifting bag and firing all 6 thrusters, the ship was once again violently jerked with motion. Without computerized guidance, the bag simply filled with its maximum capacity and continued to overflow helium till the connection was severed. The 6 thrusters also fired at uncontrolled full burn, rocketing them upwards. Thousands of tons of sulfide smashed into the fusion-powered interstellar ship. With containment lost, 8 trillion electrons freed from their confinement shot out in every direction. Spathy would later learn that the Orbital Refinement Center saw the flash with the naked vision. Nothing was built to survive the heat of a star, and the harpoons were vaporized along with their pirates. With nothing holding them down, the ship was pulled above the clouds. If Lightbringer's mate didn't terminate him, Spathy was seriously considering doing it herself. End of story. I would quickly like to thank our Tier 5 patrons and channel members: Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, it's difficult to pronounce, Lord Arishikal, Dragzoon WRE, and Arcadian. Thank you very much.